I'm not sure we seize the moment. It's more like the moment seizes us. And 2 hours and 40 minutes of my moments were seized this weekend by seeing the film Boyhood by Richard Linklater, who wrote and directed it. It starred Eller Coltrane, Patricia Arquette, Ethan Hawke, and the director's daughter, Lorelei Linklater. That this movie has been getting a lot of buzz. It's quite historic, and that it was shot over the course of 12 years. That it follows the lives of the two children, centering on Mason, who's played by Eller Coltrane, and it shows him growing up. That each year they shot for about 3 to 4 days, cost about $20,000 each time. The cast would meet up, shoot it for those 4 days, and then they would come back together a year later. But because of this style of filming, the script wasn't really finished when the movie started shooting. That you see a lot of pop culture changing the way it is that the film develops, and also it was mentioned that the way that Eller himself grows up influenced the way that Mason's character developed. That Richard Linklater specifically set the script up so that it would match at least a little bit with the interests of the main actor, just for logistic reasons, and also it gives it this very natural feel. That I've gone into this being someone who's never really seen any of the other films that Richard Linklater has done. I personally feel like this film was amazing. It was a very different experience from most of my other film-going ventures, some of which probably came down to the theater that I saw it in, but overall, I highly recommend this movie to anybody who appreciates the artistic side of filmmaking. It really feels like something you've never seen before. It's a time capsule up to the modern day. That everything that goes into this movie was picked masterfully. That the opening shot really gives you this sense of wonder and ambiguity, and within the first 10 minutes, the tone of the film is solid. That you see that they don't pull any punches just because the protagonist is young. That it starts off right away with showing how damaged both of his parents are, how turbulent the relationship is between them, and at the same time, these kids who are on screen, they feel really natural in a way that a lot of child actors don't. That I was watching the relationship between Mason and Samantha, the two siblings, and I kept on having flashbacks to ways that my neighbors acted when I was kids, and there are lots of moments that, for me, as someone who grew up around the time frame that the movie set in, I was born just a couple of years before Mason would have been, that there are a lot of things that they show in this movie that are things that I remember from my childhood. So for me, it had this real feeling of nostalgia at the very beginning, and it really captured what it felt like to be growing up in that time frame, at least in my opinion. That the soundtrack, again, the way that they picked the songs so that it always coordinates with the time period, it really gave it this sense. It cued you in a way that only music can. That, well, in concept, the thing that helps your memory most is smells, but we've seen that doesn't work very well for movies, so sound and songs really stick with us, and it was a great tool to, without having to tell you what year it was, to get you to think back to the time that when you first heard those songs. It opened up with a Coldplay song, so that was Yellow, and then it ended with like Arcade Fire and Foster the People, so it's the kind of music I would listen to anyway, so I personally feel like, not even from the sense of it setting the tone, that it was a solid soundtrack, but that's kind of the least of the things that this movie did right. All the performers did a great job. That it was really cool to see the progression. Almost like watching people you were watching people grow up. So it's a little bit of a gimmick, but at the same time, it's really cool as an experience and an experiment. And I feel like it's just not the way that films are traditionally made, obviously, and it works directly because of that. that it's always been my philosophy going into watching a movie that the best thing that a filmmaker could do is to show me something that's never been done before. And the more movies there are, the harder that is to do. But with the way that this movie was approached, with having to fit the plot line in reality, that it gave it a structure that is completely unique. It doesn't follow the beat-by-beat storyline, screenwriting 101 arc out of necessity. It can't do the arc in the plot line, but you still see the development in the characters as they're growing up, because it's not manufactured, it's just a natural consequence of living. And by following the way that these people looked and then adding a story to it, it's got some slight elements of a documentary without being anything like it. So because of that, this movie has its own unique identity. And even though there's a lot of heavy material in this, that relationships do not necessarily work out for everybody who's involved, which makes it feel very real, at the same time, there's this sense of warmth about the movie and wonder, and it doesn't treat any of the subject matter of growing up with that kind. It doesn't sugarcoat anything, but at the same time, it still has that slight sense of wonder, which gets brought on by the music and just focusing on these happy moments. Okay, so the way that the story is told in this movie, it doesn't follow the traditional narrative structure, and a lot of it comes down to the way that the movie was captured. That you'd see this style more in a documentary than you would in a narrative film, generally speaking. That we see windows into the main character Mason's life. That the movie starts when he's 6, and then we see a couple of days in his life with his mother and his father, and then it skips ahead a year. And we see what has changed in that time, and his relationship again with his father, his mother, and then another skip, we see his new stepfather, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go any more into depth than that because I don't want to spoil what happens in the picture. But when you're watching these people's lives in this condensed space, it's almost like going to a family reunion and catching up, and at the same time, you'd think that it would be really difficult to follow when we're skipping over all these plot lines, but at the same time, they are very good at establishing the changes, so you never really get lost. And this movie I didn't go to see on my own. I saw it with my mother, and she had a little bit of a harder time adjusting, but not very long. Again, she's like, within a minute, she understood what was happening. So a lot of this movie consists of people sitting down and having conversations with others, and that's what gives it this really naturalistic feel. And what helps is that a lot of these conversations can be pretty funny. One of my favorite moments in the movie, even though it didn't really have that much thematic similar poignance, it's just the fact that they even caught this, was they have a little bit with Mason talking to his father, and Mason's going on about how what the Star Wars movies would be like, and how they shouldn't make any more of them, and if they do, they're not going to be able to make them after Episode 6, because what would you do? And this was captured at a time which was obviously before any of these announcements could have been made, so the fact that it's prophetic just made it hilarious for me, knowing that they could not have predicted that was what actually happened, except that's exactly what happened. So those little moments like that are amusing if you keep in mind the context of where people were. That in some ways I could see people getting caught up in the fact that this movie is an achievement and losing the sense of what it is as a film in and of itself, rather than what it is as a note in the history of cinema. But at the same time, you really shouldn't separate the film from what it means, because a film like this is more than just the storyline, especially considering that the story is it's not set in stone just based on the way that the thing was put together. You could see foreshadowing, but to the same extent, some of it would be coincidence. You see patterns arising in people's lives, which tends to be the case with everybody that you know, and it just falls into place. And it all feels very casual. So it's one of the more natural movies that I've ever seen, that it doesn't feel like you're there watching a film. It feels more like you're there watching people. And that's the way that a lot of movies should feel. So in that sense, it's a complete success. That when I'm looking at my top movies of the year, I had quite the conundrum deciding where to put this one. It is easily in my top 3, even though a movie like this would not normally have been my favorites. My favorite tend to be sci-fi and comic book movies. So it's contending with Captain America. I think is still my number 1, but I think I'll put this above X-Men Future Past, and so I was just looking at my film list going, this is a weird list. But anyway, this movie has been in a very limited release so far, which I feel like has been to its benefit, that where I happen to be working this summer, quite a few people have seen this, and if they're not, they're planning to see it, so we have kind of a sense of ownership over here in New York. But it'll be coming out in the rest of the world soon, and the fact that it's come here, I feel like, is a good strategy, because it's going to get some buzz rolling. That I don't think I heard anyone come out of this theater thinking it was a waste of their time. And considering this is a 2-hour, 40-minute movie that does have some moments where it drags, that even in those moments when it slows down and it doesn't feel like a lot is happening, it's still very personal. And that is the strength of the movie. That the people feel very real, and a lot of that comes down to the way that it was written. And just working off of the natural consequences of what's going on in the actors' lives so that it all feels normal and comforting, yet still really unsettling and kind of depressing at points, but at the same time you come out of it feeling like, yay, it's the future is coming, and you'll look back in another 12 years at all the strange stuff that was going on in 2014, and you'll be like, what? Why was that popular? We were still, and maybe Twitter will still be a really big thing, but I feel like that's going to be something that 5 years from now we'll be like, why did we do that? So yeah, this highly recommended to anybody who's really interested in the art of filmmaking, anybody who likes this kind of natural, slow-paced. It's very much in the drama with some comedy. I would recommend it more for an older audience, though it is very cool as someone my age going to see this movie and seeing all of the things that are very similar to what it is that I grew up with. I'm not sure this would be everybody's cup of tea. Even film students, people who are really into art, and people who are maybe, I would say over 40, but my mom actually didn't like it as much as me, so I think it's probably more of a movie for people who see a lot of movies. It's a movie for people who are critics. It's a film festival movie, which is great. I love those. But at the same time, this isn't going to be the kind of movie that someone who's a casual moviegoer, not to be condescending, I just mean someone who's going to the movie because they want to have a good adventure. This is not the movie for you. This is the movie for somebody who wants to see something and then wants to be talking about it for 5 days later because they're still thinking about, oh, how this thing related to my life, or even if they're complaining about it. Because I have seen a few people who are being contrarian about this, but I feel like the people who go into this movie and come out, and if they fit into what I'm explaining, the people who go into this movie with an open mind and an empty bladder, because that is a really long time to sit, that you'll probably come out of it satisfied, even if it's not the best thing that you've seen all year, like I feel like it is almost is for me. That this is not really a rainy day movie, this is more of a middle of the day movie. Don't go when you're super tired, because I don't think this is going to keep you awake while you're watching it. But if you watch the whole thing, it might keep you awake for a couple hours after you're done, just because you're so interested in considering what your life is and how you've changed and how everyone around you has changed and the world has changed. It's whenever you're condensing things to this extent and that really lets you look at the world as a whole and think about how much, if someone did this again, how much everything would change. And you can barely recognize yourself once those 12 years go by, at least when you're a kid, and everyone grew up. It's our shared experience. So anyone who's grown up and wants to go back and think about it and is willing to and knows that a 3-hour movie where nothing explodes is not something that puts them off, yes, please go see this movie when it comes to you, because this was amazing. Alright, thank you. Bye. Oh, and I apologize that my audio equipment evidently sucks. I didn't listen to it before I put the last video up. Excuse me. Alright, bye.